Without any further ado, I would like to welcome Saleem Ali to Boston University. Saleem is an old friend and colleague. He's not old, he's just a friend and colleague for a long time. And is now an associate professor of environment and also South Asian studies at the University of Vermont, and a very, very prolific writer on a whole host of important and compelling topics. And he's going to talk to us today about his latest book, which is called Treasures of the Earth. This is therefore going to be a different format from our usual seminars. Usually we have three people discussing a theme, but today we wanted to give Saleem enough time to talk about his book and then take questions and answers from it. It is a fascinating topic. It's a topic of great relevance to the future because it has also been of great relevance to the past. Conflicts over resources and conflicts over treasures of the earth. All yours, Saleem.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be back in Boston. I spent much of my academic life in the Boston area, and I'm especially pleased to be here at the Pardee Center. I followed the work of the center. It does provide a very unique location to study the long-range future, those of us who are interested in lower discount rates and thinking more in the long term. It's wonderful that Frederick Pardee has supported that vision. And of course, to have Adil's leadership to move it forward. Now, the question that I started this book with, and here's a copy of the book, is would the world be a better place if we somehow curbed our desires for material consumption? And the reason why I wrote this book was that I'm first and foremost an environmental studies professor. So teaching is very important for me. It's my bread and butter. I enjoy doing it. And what I feel is that so many students in environmental studies are very much influenced by a dominant narrative that tends to trivialize resource usage, resource consumption in terms of a very minimalist, reductionist approach, and also tries to in some ways romanticize poverty, where people are so worried about focusing on human needs versus human wants, that we are moving more and more within the environmental studies domain to a vision of the world where we're trying to focus completely on the issue of excessive consumption, and sometimes even forgetting that the origins of the environmental movement were in another very important variable, which was population. And if you then try to unpack population also, where is that population and the value of each human life in terms of that population? So this book really tries to grapple in some ways with the issues of economic inequality, the environment, and resource distribution. And I use minerals both as a metaphor for resources, but also quite literally as the ultimate resources, because the periodic table, or however you want to define the elements, are really our most fundamental resource base, right? Even if you want to have energy, you're dependent on the elements in some ways and trying to have that energy available. So at a very basic level, quite literally at an elemental level, I wanted to focus on the issue of minerals. There were some other motivating factors to try and focus on minerals also. After 9/11, there has been a very dominant perspective which tends to link resource usage to conflict. And a lot of my other work has been on conflict resolution. I've tried to reconfigure the debate in some of my other writings on seeing how environmental issues can be a source of cooperation and not just a source of conflict. And that's where I also wanted to revisit this issue of minerals and conflict, and to see how we can perhaps have a more constructive engagement with the issue of resource conflicts and this very common phrase that's used, the resource curse. Which tends to specially focus on non-renewable resources, so oil and the fossil fuels, of course, but also increasingly diamonds and other kinds of luxury-based minerals. So So the book has a very ambitious agenda in that way, that it tries to reconfigure the debate on sustainability by asking that question about would the world be a better place in terms of minimal consumption, and I come out with the answer, a nuanced no. Okay, that indeed if we just focused on reducing consumption, the world would not be a better place. Now that's not to say that we should have profligate consumption, that's not to say that we should have wastage, but that we need to be strategic in our consumption. And even that argument is very difficult for, even that kind of very moderate argument is very difficult for many environmentalists to accept in this day and age, because there's this perception that we'll be going down a slippery slope if we go that way. And so this is how I start the conversation is, look, we are living in a world where we have three competing goals. One goal is environmental challenges need to be addressed and we need to mitigate the impact on the environment, right? So we have to think about ecosystems and conservation issues, important. The second goal is increasingly addressing poverty and inequality. Okay, global inequality. And I approach this issue of inequality head on, and that's where my narrative is very different from some of the other critics of environmentalism who try to still be very much focused on the old capitalist model. I'm not taken in by the old capitalist model, but I am very much interested in issues of how we can be pragmatic in solving our problems of inequality. So as you know, a lot of the people on the right of the political spectrum, they don't want to talk about inequality. So in that way, I am much more sympathetic to the left. But at the same time, I am also willing to criticize the dominant environmental narrative, which sometimes pushes me more to the right of the political spectrum. So I've done a few radio interviews for this, and the first things, if someone just sees a cursory sort of a perusal of the book, they'll say, oh, this is maybe another Beyond Lombok. And no, I am not another Beyond Lombok by a long shot for various reasons. One is that I don't try to reduce the magnitude of the challenges that confront us. I'm not saying that that the statistics can be used in some way to show that actually things are not so bad. I'm saying things are probably pretty bad in terms of environmental challenges. But we still have those other two issues to look at. We have the inequality, and the third one is this quest for democratic pluralism, for trying to get people to think about individual choice in certain ways that we're often, in the environmental movement, often uncomfortable with. And it's no surprise that environmentalists have gravitated in some ways towards models of totalitarian societies as good examples. Cuba, you were mentioning you're going to have a conference on Cuba. There has been a tendency among many of my dear environmentalist friends to romanticize Cuba, that they're growing vegetables in parking lots, and how cool is that? And and again, not realizing that what is being sacrificed many times in those contexts as well, in terms of pluralism. So what do we end up with? If you're going to try and balance these three aspects, and these are a little bit different from the old sustainable development aspects, there's some similarity but somewhat different. There you had the economic and the social and the environmental, but I'm really focusing much more on the goal aspect of the narrative, and I'm saying we should be normative in trying to reduce poverty in the same way, having economic inequality, not just poverty in absolute terms, but inequality addressed. And we also have to worry about the quest for pluralism at some level. So what will we end up with? We'll probably end up with a suboptimal outcome when it comes to one of those criteria, right? And that's also very difficult for environmental colleagues to grapple with, because the way they then approach it is that we have the environment is the ultimate resource. And I say, well, minerals are the ultimate resource, actually. The environment, if you have a utopian vision of the environment, yes, sure, you're going to say, this is the way we want the world to be. But the world is going to be changing regardless. And so we want to do it in a way that those life support systems are sustained, and that we are able to harness those resources, the ultimate form of which are the minerals themselves, so that those livelihoods can be sustained as well. So that's really the challenge. And to do it, you will end up with a suboptimal outcome. And this goes back to, if you're looking at, theoretical issues, Amartya Sen's impossibility theorem, in terms of trying to have Pareto optimality in this kind of context of a pluralistic society. The Sen's famous paper, The Impossibility of a Paretian Liberal, some of you may be familiar with. Or it goes back to Ken Arrow's impossibility theorem about voting and so on. And so I've just brought in the environmental lens to that aspect as well. Now, I've given you a little handout just to give you a flavor for the book. The book is written for a general nonfiction audience. So I wanted it to be very accessible so that you can actually buy it in a Barnes and Noble, and the general audience will find it easy to read. But I didn't want to dumb it down also. So it was a bit of a challenge writing it. I love writing, it's a passion of mine. And so I tried to make it very reader friendly, but it does have a lot of information in terms of the academic background and citations, and I did go with an academic press to publish it for that reason, even though it's through Yale University Press's trade division. So I worked with an agent and a publicist and all that, but it's peer reviewed. In fact, it had 4 peer reviews, and I could have gone with someone like John Wiley, or more of a traditional trade publication publisher like what Freakonomics has done or some of that, but I didn't want to dumb it down to that level, where those trade presses would want it to be. And so it was a challenging book to write in that way, but I'm generally pleased with the product. So what I'll do is I'll go through some of the main aspects of the book, and then we can open it up for discussion. And there is one figure I've included also in the front of this little handout I put together, which is a diagram from the National Museum of Scotland I visited a few years ago, and it was a very intriguing diagram that I then sort of reconfigured a little bit. And it tries to show you sort of the harmonization of knowledge around the earth sciences. One of my other pet peeves in terms of teaching is that so many of my environmental studies students are not interested in the natural science. They are much more interested in the social science aspects, and I would include economists within that, or they're interested in the humanities and the activism around environmental issues. But they don't want to grapple with the tough natural science issues. And one of the things I try to do in terms of this diagram is to show how important the natural sciences are to understanding ecological challenges. And sort of earth sciences is in the middle of the diagram in terms of how these different systems are related. Now, if you look at the layout of the book on the reverse side of the handout, I've divided it into 3 parts. The first part, which I call the pleasure of treasure, that tries to lay out the natural history of human relations with minerals. And what I try to argue there is that even if you go back in human history, our relationship with minerals has not been all about need. It's been about wants many times. So, for example, the first known mines in Swaziland were in fact for ochre, for cosmetics. And through that process, people learned about other minerals, and they were able to extract other need-based minerals. Eventually, we had iron, eventually we had other minerals, copper and so on, which were integral for human societies to develop and so on, right? And so it's very important for us to appreciate that need and want have always been interconnected at that level. And that if we try to dichotomize our human needs and our wants, we might stifle that very impulse to explore and discover, which may be essential for us to solve our environmental problems. And this doesn't make me a technological optimist per se. What I'm saying is, if we are encountering such a serious environmental challenge, the one thing we always want to salvage is that impulse to seek solutions. We want to be able to extend the time frame as much as possible for seeking solutions to the environmental challenges, right? So we do that by conserving, we do that by being more efficient, but we don't want to stifle that impulse itself. to seek solutions, to explore, to discover. And that's what I call the treasure impulse. And I trace that back to that human desire for minerals and our connection with minerals at a very elemental level. And of course, you can talk about gold and other kinds of minerals as well. I cover a lot of those aspects, like gemstones, in the first chapter of in the first part of the book. The second part looks at the problems of resource extraction. And I certainly call a spade in terms of mining and its impact. I'm not trying to diminish the impact of especially some kinds of mining, like gold mining with cyanide or mountaintop removal mining in the Appalachians. And I completely relate the full story there in terms of the level of impacts and the damages. But then what I also try to link it with is the psychology of extraction and resource exploitation. And there has been a lot of debate about this in terms of the literature on well-being, what makes us happy. And those of you who are familiar with ecological economics literature are familiar with a lot of these studies which have been done on human well-being and linking that to consumption, or usually not consumption, saying that most people do not need to consume to be happy. And I present the full scope of the literature there, because it's a little bit deceiving the way often it's presented in some of these studies, because they tend to just take a certain survey data and they don't look at the full theory in terms of cognitive science and so on of happiness, in terms of the hedonic treadmill and other aspects of that. The happiness set point, for example, a lot of these studies completely negate the fact that most psychologists now believe that 50% of human happiness is predetermined in terms of your predisposition genetically, or your temperament, or however you may want to call it that. And then you have about 10% which is based on some societal factors, and then there's the 40% where you have some leverage in terms of whether it's affected by consumption, or just sort of ballpark figures. But that's the general consensus among social psychologists. So I look into that aspect of well-being, and I go back in the literature to like Bertrand Russell and The Conquest of Happiness, which I think is probably one of the finest books on the topic and has been largely forgotten by the current well-being researchers. Then the third part tries to focus more on solutions, again with the lens on materials and minerals per se. And this is where my lens is very much twofold. One is through industrial ecology, because I do feel that industries are here to stay in the long run. And especially living in Vermont, I have to deal with these conflicts a lot, because people in Vermont tend to be very anti-industry generally. Anytime you bring it up, it becomes a huge conflict. It's the last state even to have a Walmart store, and the whole thing is, so it was for me very personal at that level too, in this idyllic, bucolic life versus industrial development. And so I look at it from the perspective of how we can recycle materials and minerals. What are some of the latest trends in terms of industrial ecology? Because that's ultimately what we should be focusing on. I also address some of the critics of efficiency in there, because there is a very dominant strain among environmentalists now which are saying, well, efficiency is bad too, because actually efficiency just will bring out latent demand and we won't in fact get any difference in consumption patterns. And they refer to this old 19th century coal economist Jevons and his work, where he called the Jevons Paradox, where he said that basically even if you have efficiency improvements, people are going to end up consuming more because there is still demand and people will just try to want more. And I try to unpack that a little bit and say, well, that can be true in some contexts. In the case of the developing world, it may well be true. And even if it is true, if it's below a certain minimal level of well-being, we should encourage that, because remember, one of the three spires is poverty alleviation and inequality, and we cannot neglect that. So I do have a very developmental lens, which I think the Pardee Center also encourages. And at the same time, I'm not saying that we shouldn't strive for having some kind of a different worldview. If people can be thought to be more self-sufficient and self-reliant and happy with less, sure, go for it. And that's fine. If you compare Japan versus the United States, the Japanese model of having development and relatively minimal consumption for a developed country, that's fine, go for it, encourage it. I'm not saying that we should try and disparage that. All I'm saying is that we should not try to make the case that developing countries in some ways should be sanguine with their predicament. We should not make the case that subsistence lifestyles are somehow preferable to lifestyles where people are trying to yearn for more material goods to a certain point, because they will be needing them to some degree. If you're living in a slum in Mumbai, you probably do want to have some better well-being, better material consumption, and we cannot underestimate that aspect. So then what is our choice? Well, the choice is that we have to find better ways of reusing materials, getting them back from the system. That's our only way. So I have a whole segment which describes scavenging, for example, the whole tradition of scavenging in human societies, and how the industrial ecology narrative has tried to revisit scavenging in various ways, right? So material take back, life cycle analysis, all those tools. Which even with all those tools, a lot of environmentalists, mainstream environmentalists, still disparage them because they think that they somehow people will become optimistic, they will become complacent, and hence we will be down that slippery slope where we're back to square one. And what I'm saying is that is something which, if you keep going on that path, actually you will stifle the creativity and that treasure impulse, which itself is really going to be our only salvation. Okay? So it's a little bit of a nuanced argument at that level, which I'm glad to see slowly people are beginning to appreciate more so. And for example, there was a review of the book in Forbes magazine, an advanced review, and the writer was able to capture that aspect pretty well. And she said, oh, he's not the traditional liberal by any means, but he's also not a libertarian where he's like free for all and so on. So the role of regulation is very important in the way I'm arguing for this case. And then the other aspect which I look at apart from industrial ecology is restoration ecology. And this is also very controversial among environmentalists. Even so, I mean, I thought that, going back to my days as an undergraduate, we used to compare the preservationists and the conservationists and Gifford Pinchot and John Muir, and I thought that debate was over. Well, I have news for you, it's not over, because you still have people who are very much determined to say, look, the ultimate ecosystem, the natural system, that is something which we still must be yearning for and going back to. And we have writers, based in Vermont, very notable ones like Bill McKibben, for example, very influential ones, whom I have a lot of respect for as writers and as people who have a very well-intentioned goal, who are still focused on that aspect. And what I'm saying is it's not going to happen if you have those three goals. So restoration can provide us with a very important lens to move forward. And the whole field of restoration ecology, which has now developed quite a bit, is another way by which we can approach this. So that chapter looks at especially the restoration of mine lands. And up to what point can that happen? The technical aspects are described too, but again in very accessible terms. And then I end with this chapter in the epilogue also, where I refer to embracing the treasure impulse and also embracing uncertainty, where I try to also provide some insights on scenario analysis, on how we can use scenario analysis to try and consider policy options in dealing with these challenges. And I'll try to end with actually the last paragraph of the book, perhaps, because it gives you a little bit of more of a humorous ending to this. I end with a story of this engineer at General Electric, where I used to work, incidentally. Between my master's and my PhD for 2 years, I worked at GE at one of their research centers in Niskayuna in New York. And this was the place where they developed the synthetic diamond. Okay, so the GE patented the process by which you can develop synthetic diamonds. So here's the story. Robert Wentoff Jr., who worked at General Electric's research center in Niskayuna, as an avid snacker, Wentoff always kept a jar of peanut butter and some crackers on his desk. In his research to manufacture synthetic diamonds, he decided to have some fun in the process. Knowing that diamonds were essentially carbon and most edibles were carbon-based molecules, he used his favorite brand of peanut butter in the trial run for diamond synthesis. With the technological prowess at his disposal, he converted a dollop of his favorite snacking spread into tiny green crystals of diamonds. Okay? The green color, to Wentworth's amusement, was the result of some nitrogen bonding in the process. His friend Herb Strong, another eminent scientist at GE, is known to have laughed afterward and said, "The pity is you can't turn diamonds into peanut butter." Perhaps that day will come as well. Our path towards, so this is my ending now, our path towards synthetic consumption with a new range of energy sources may lead to a very different world from the one we know. Okay? And this is where I'm not just an optimist. That world might be closer to the fictional representation in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner or Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, or maybe even Wall-E. But it will still be our world with all its material desires, quests for efficiency, and creative paths that test our minds. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Saleem. I'm not going to come there. If you can maybe take some questions, I'm sure
I'd be happy
to be many. If I can, since I have the mic in my hand.
Yep.
Make an announcement when you ask a question. Please wait for the mic. It may not do anything to your voice, but it will make your question be recorded. If I can start with a question. You spend a lot of time responding to what the critics might say.
Yeah.
And since I hold some of those views that like on efficiency and stuff that you've been challenging, let me ask one question to get. The title has want, need, and greed.
Need, greed, and a sustainable future.
Okay.
Yeah.
But and you talk mostly about want and need.
Yeah.
Now, my sense is, apart from Vermont, the rest of us have figured that one out. Our concern is largely on the greed, which you didn't say much about. Mm-hmm. That one can understand the treasure impulse for wants, but there is a place where it turns into greed. Yeah. And there is a place where a societal ethos turns where greed is in fact good.
Yeah.
And that's no longer a questionable attribute. And that's where I think a lot of the people who might, who you're talking about have concerns. What would you say about greed?
Well, I think want and greed are interconnected in some way. I mean, the ultimate sort of motivator for greed, if it is that, sort of asymptotically saying, okay, there will never be enough. We may have perhaps marginally less desire. What I am saying is that greed even itself at that level, that impulse for greed itself is not necessarily something which is bad either if it can be regulated and controlled properly, because it's very hard to get people to for example, I talk about gambling itself. What motivates people to gamble? It's a very similar impulse to what motivates people to go and look for minerals as well. So they want to make it big, right, at some level. Now, what you have to do then is to be able to get that same impulse and channel it properly. So, for example, I have a whole section which looks at philanthropy then at the end, you need to be able to have that same greed-based desire, but to make the individual feel sufficient, that we have enough for ourselves. Like Warren Buffett, he lives in a regular house in Omaha, 4,000 square foot house. He's not into having huge mega mansions, but he has greed. It's not just want; it is greed, and that greed has led him to be innovative. It's just that on a personal basis, he is sufficiently satisfied. So that's the kind of thing I would argue for, that at the individual level, absolutely, the person should move towards what Thomas Princeton calls the logic of sufficiency. But at a societal level, having greed is not necessarily bad if you have a much larger societal goal in mind. Okay, so that's the distinction I make.
Hi, I'm Mikael Munoz from the Pardee Center.
Yep.
I have a question. I mean, very good presentation. I'm actually going to read the book. You convinced me.
Thank you.
I have a question. You make a big difference between minerals and the rest of the resources, and you say that minerals are the ultimate resource. And I'm wondering if you could justify more. And I'm thinking in the history of humanity, you have all these resources that civilizations have fought for: wheat, silk, spices, cotton, and
but even you see
fishing,
even with plants, if you think about it, ultimately they're dependent on minerals. I mean, if you think about the big revolution in terms of agriculture, it was largely dependent on nitrate and phosphate fertilizer, and that was dependent on minerals. And I have a whole little segment in there titled Guns, Guano and Butter. And Guns, Guano and Butter deals with the fact that in South America, one of the earliest wars that you might be familiar with was over guano, over the control of these ancient phosphate deposits, which the British amazingly had control over. And it was, if it was not for the Haber process to be able to make nitrate synthetically, people would still be fighting the same way over that. So ultimately, that's why I say minerals are the ultimate resource. I mean, even for energy at our levels, of course, energy and matter are connected by Einstein's famous equation. But for our purposes, in practical terms, to get energy, even you need to use materials in some form. And I must say, my first degree was in chemistry. So I even though I've become more of an applied social scientist, I have a chemical bias there. So, yes.
Thank you. My question is more along the lines of kind of politics and governance. I'm just wondering, in terms of conflict resources, especially in Africa, which has been one of the worst places, where does the onus of responsibility lie to responsibly use these? So does it lie particularly with the national government? Does it lie with the international community? Does it lie with international corporations? I was just wondering where you think the best way to go forward there is.
With conflict diamond specifically,
or
coltan. Yes, so I mean the clear issue is that resources, there's no doubt, if you go back to colonial times, they have been used to fuel wars. They have been used as an excuse for war, but it isn't just minerals. My first argument is, if you look at the colonialism of the Caribbean, it was for sugarcane. If you, in Madagascar, where I've done some work, when the price of vanilla was very high, vanilla was actually, there was a black market for vanilla. I mean, what's more innocent than vanilla? So for one thing, I would say that it depends on the structure of the situation. It's not just minerals. The environmentalist narrative that it's diamonds and non-renewable resources is problematic. In Liberia, it's rubber. It's a renewable resource, but that's the source. And if you look at, in fact, the Liberian conflict, more than diamonds, timber was much more linked to conflict, okay, which is a renewable resource in that way. So that's one side of the story, that you don't want to just focus on the non-renewable aspect. Then the importance of governance structures is very significant. In all cases in Africa, if you look at some of the data also, and this is where I have a beef with some of these dominant resource curse theorists like Paul Collier and also Michael Ross and so on. The use of regression as a technique to just focus on the conflict determinism is very problematic too. And I have a whole chapter called Curing the Resource Curse, where I try to go through some of the problems in which that regression has been used for deterministic modeling and so on. So what I say is, look, you clearly want regulations to be able to manage that. You have, for example, the Kimberley process. You have the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. They have problems still. They have not been perfected. We had a problem with Zimbabwe recently and the Kimberley process. Incidentally, the first time I met Adil was in Zimbabwe when it was the good old days, and now, of course, it's a part of the challenge has been that they've been able to have illegal diamond mining, and that's not been regulated by the Kimberley process. So I'm not saying there are no problems, but if you can develop the right mechanisms, you can enforce them pretty well with even something like diamonds, which is a highly lootable resource. There's little doubt that the Kimberley process has overall stopped a lot of the conflict diamond trade because of the certificates and how they work. So I think that's the way to approach it. The other argument I make is one of geographic determinism. You have to, whenever you're doing a planning exercise, you look at different livelihood potentials for a community. Now, it's possible that in some communities there are many livelihood potentials, right? Like New Caledonia, where I've done some work in the French Pacific. It's a beautiful island. You could have a wonderful tourist trade there. You could have many other kinds of renewable resource trades. But the French decided that this was a huge nickel deposit, and that would be the sole focus of the economy, would be nickel, really. I would say that's probably not a good idea. So in that case, maybe mining was not a good idea. But what about a place like northern Saskatchewan, or maybe a place like Chad, where you are not likely to have a rollicking tourist industry or other potentials? Then minerals may be an essential part of that development trajectory, and we cannot ignore them for that reason. You want to use them as catalysts for development. You want to be able to find ways to manage the funds, like Norway does with its trust funds, for how the revenues will be used later once the resource expires. But they will play a very important role. And you cannot just dismiss exceptions also within this larger narrative, like Botswana, or Chile. And people say, oh, no, Botswana is different. No, Botswana is a very interesting case. Why should we just say, oh, it's a separate case? It had everything going against it initially, one of the poorest countries in Africa. But then it was able to, with the find of diamonds, it was able to reconfigure itself. Good leadership, other aspects of the issue were there. But if it can happen there, why not use it as a good example and try to replicate it?
Hi, David Graywell, the Harvard Society of Fellows. I'm really sympathetic to this argument there's no such thing as a resource curse. It reminds me of some of the work coming out now about the responses to so-called natural disasters. The same idea being that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. There are risks that social groups can't either do or don't mitigate against in the aftermath. But so by the very same token, I'm curious about this idea of minerals as the ultimate resource, because I would think there's no such thing as a natural resource either. There's a natural world that is made valuable through human needs, wants, and so on. Which brings me to the question of politics. And I want you to say more about the political, the democratic pluralism and the role of politics in this whole story, because it seems that you're not sympathetic to the standard picture of economics, that somehow there will emerge a form of coordination that the treasure impulse will just be naturally directed, as it were, by an invisible hand. Things will work out. You put regulation forward as the central process that will turn our natural resources mediated through human wants into something that we can actually live with. But then I haven't heard about what form of politics you're envisioning to make that happen, and what the challenges are for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the forms of politics for managing these resources, I think regulations which can develop innovation are the ones to be favored. So I'm all for regulations, technology forcing regulations, as we call them. I'm less inclined to have command and control at the level where you are going to potentially stifle innovation and you just say this is the way to do it. And that may be efficient sometimes, but if it is going to stifle innovation in the long run, I think it will be inefficient even then. So that's where I would say we can make some sort of a touchstone distinction. The other aspect with regard to human rights issues, I'm very inclined to support some more absolutist aspects of human rights regulations, which are linked to some of the issues of minerals. So, for example, child labor issues, where there needs to be a greater enforcement of those kinds of basic human rights regulations at an international level, and especially so with minerals, where they have been a major issue. One of the areas where I've worked on recently is artisanal mining, small-scale mining, where child labor is a major issue, women's rights are a major issue, and you need much more absolute regulations there. You can't talk about markets and all in that context either. So.
Hi. So I actually wanted to go back to the comment that you made about Botswana.
Yeah.
They are an interesting case, and they are doing very well in terms of any other African nation, pretty much, because of the diamond reserves that they found. Yeah. The only thing is like how their programs are ran. It's like very ineffective, very inefficient. They don't keep track of what's going on. They just continue to throw money at it, and like down the line, when the reserves start to run out, there's going to be issues. And so I guess my question is, like, what's your thought on in terms of programs that will be more efficient, more effective way of doing things.
I mean, I think that's an issue of internal management. You can't blame diamonds for that per se. I mean, I think as with any government, one could argue the US government is very inefficient in the same way. What I find very compelling about Botswana is, for example, they've been very progressive in terms of their attitude towards AIDS. You know, a lot of the narrative, like the Michael Ross narrative is, oh, countries which have resources, they have less incentives to develop their cultural proclivities in a positive way. So he has all these regressions which the Washington Post liked a lot, which show that countries which have oil have terrible women's rights. And you know, even as a Muslim, I would say that doesn't make much sense, because you have to look at the implementation of Islamic theology and so on as the determinant of that, and don't just give that a pass completely just because it just so happens that oil exists in those countries, you know. And you might have a country like Yemen, which doesn't have much oil and has even worse women's rights than some of the other neighbors, you know. So that's my concern with the Botswana case, is that you will of course find problems, but you have a very dynamic, vibrant political structure which even defies some of these other arguments. Like, for example, the San Bushmen case in Botswana. You had a situation where the Botswana government, in this old style of saying, well, we have to civilize these indigenous people, they just tried to move them all into one area, and this was in the Kalahari Game Reserve. And the environmentalists immediately cried foul, and they said this is because the government wants to mine diamonds in the game reserve. Now, I have been a big critic of many of the companies. In all the mining companies have had a checkered past, Rio Tinto, Anglo-American, De Beers, right? But now things have changed quite a bit, and to blame the fact that now if they wanted to do this movement of the San because of the diamonds, it didn't make much sense on a technical level. But anyhow, the case went forward. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the San. And they told the government of Botswana that they have every right to move about as they wish in their indigenous lifestyles. So here was a case where even the argument that the companies control the statist structure didn't hold water. The Supreme Court ruled against the government. The government agreed to that case, and they were allowed to go back. So, you know, I think that we need to be more willing to acknowledge these successes. Of course there are problems. I mean, I remember when I was doing my first work in Botswana, I was looking at water, transboundary water projects. And the water minister got very upset with me. She wrote a letter to the dean at the time saying that why do we have these American students who are coming and doing research on our strategic reserves of water? You know, and I was like, what are they talking about, you know? And so I had a personal issue there with the way they were doing, but I'm not going to use that to say that the whole government is a disaster, you know. I think it's actually pretty good given those constraints.
Hello, Trevor Green, International Relations and Environmental Policy.
Yeah.
So from a development perspective, if we're to call minerals the ultimate resource, countries that lack that form of capital but maybe have more of an abstract form, I mean, like cultural capital or even human, how are they expected to overcome this lack of a greed-based resource and develop nonetheless?
So, so you're saying countries like Singapore and all, which may not have natural resources.
Yeah, or Rwanda in Africa. I mean,
yeah. So well, that's why trade is so important, you know, and that's my other beef with our dear environmental colleagues, that they keep disparaging trade completely, you know. And so, if even from an ecological perspective, where the resources are, if people don't want to live completely in alignment with where the resources are optimally located, right? There's where the democratic choice pluralism comes in too. Some people want to live in Indiana, some people want to live on the coast, whatever. Then you have to have trade. There's no other way. I mean, so Singapore is a manufacturing economy, but it doesn't have its own mineral resources, but it gets the minerals through trade, and they make our laptops or whatever it is through that process. So trade is an important aspect of it. What has happened, sadly, is that the entire trade narrative has now been subsumed by the carbon footprint analysis. So anytime you talk about transporting goods from one place to another, the only indicator they will put up oftentimes is, oh, there's a transportation cost and there's a carbon footprint, and they will not look at, I am a total believer in climate change, and I realize it's a serious problem, but that carbon footprint aspect is one aspect of a much larger calculus which we have to consider. So that's how I would respond to those countries which don't have that. Sure, they will need some aspect of trade. Maybe they will develop a service sector economy through that process. But ultimately we will still need those the resources. Maybe we won't be mining them. We will, as I said, have a more cyclical economy, right? So we're going to have to invest in technologies, what Mr. Obama is talking about across the river today in terms of green technologies. A lot of it has to do with finding ways of cycling the materials back and finding efficient ways to do that. Many green technologies still are going to be highly dependent on minerals, like hybrid car batteries. Lithium is going to play a very important role, and we have to plan for where that lithium is going to come from. The largest reserves are in Bolivia right now, so they will have to be traded with Bolivia, and that's where Evo Morales will have to open up. He can't. Everything is not going to. It won't be possible to be just insular.
You mentioned that your students and colleagues had a tendency to lean towards totalitarianism and that kind of philosophy. Mm-hmm. So what is your stance in the debate of, big government, small government, strong federal police powers versus state police powers? What is most advantageous for the earth scientists to, be most successful in, your goals?
Yeah, no, I mean, the size of the government itself should be determined partly by how efficient it is in the amount of investment that's being put into the size versus the output. Just like any other business, I would say you should try to think of it in those terms. As I said before, I have no problem with regulation. And I think regulation is very important in order to channel human behavior appropriately, because we are dealing with certain time constraints in terms of resource depletion, and people are not able to internalize time constraints on their own at that level. So you need to be able to move them in that direction. In terms of the scale itself, the other aspect which is interesting is what people talk about, the scale of corporations. This is a little bit unrelated to your question, but people often bring this up because of Walmart and the antipathy towards Walmart in Vermont. And they say, well, large scale is bad overall because small is beautiful, E.F. Schumacher, all those things, right? Well, in some cases that may well be true in terms of the kind of cultural capital and those factors which you're talking about, though that also the evidence is a little murky. There's a whole literature on the sociology of shopping malls and all emerging. But with regard to the scale aspect for solving the problems, if Walmart is going to agree to have only selling CFL light bulbs, which it has agreed to in a couple of years, the impact that will have is going to be much greater than any price signals which the government may try to legislate, right? But that's a socially responsible decision on the part of Walmart to say we will only sell CFLs. But because it's such a huge seller of anything, it's going to make a huge difference overall because the price is going to go down and it'll be much more effective. So scale is helpful in that way also in terms of making a difference, and we can't negate that aspect.
So do you think there's really no difference between state regulation then, though, and federal regulation?
Which you're talking about devolution, federal, state, local?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry, yes, yeah. So, in that way, absolutely, that's going to be determined by the domestic political culture of those areas. I worked a lot with indigenous peoples, and each place it's very different. The Apache, just to give an example, because I think that's kind of a microcosm of other human societies too. For them, a much more hierarchical system works better. In other societies where there have been a lot of fracturing culturally, like in Canada with the Quebecois problem, you're going to have more devolution, right? You have much more devolution to the provinces. So it depends on the domestic political culture of where that level is going to be potentially most effective. And in the US, I think our political culture has matured to that point where that devolution is fairly functional between federal, state, and local in terms of local planning decisions. In other places, it's less so. In Pakistan, clearly, where I'm originally from, we still haven't quite figured it out because it's still a very fractured society, and so the tensions between the federal and the provincial are more acute. So again, my touchstone will be still if we want efficiency and we want results, okay, which is what makes that process functional. Yes, Anne-Marie.
Well, thank you so much, Saleem, for your presentation. I just wanted to talk about another kind of resource. It's water, which I think is really the limiting resource, much more than minerals. And I was just thinking of how could you categorize, since you're talking about all these factors of scale and the difference in regulation that between all these different resources. I just wanted to link what you just said with, Elinor Ostrom's recent Nobel Prize in Economics, and most of her work was just precisely to show that in the case of commons, which is a very different type of resources, you need regulation, and you need and privatization is not the answer. So it's how would you make a different typology of resources and regulations?
So let me begin with water first of all, because I have done some work on water also recently. I did some work on water security for the Asia Society. Again, water ultimately is dependent on minerals, because the ultimate source of water is the oceans. The only way you are going to be able to get that is through energy of some sort. We are able to convert it, and for that you will need minerals as well. So the water and energy connection is significant as well. Of course, functionally speaking, you can't eat minerals in the same way as you need water immediately. But the harnessing of water, whether it's through dams or it's through pipeline systems, the delivery of water, the ultimate resource. I mean, the only way we'll be able to, especially if the climate change scenarios come through, the only way we'll have functional water availability is through either solar desalination or some large-scale technology. Especially in Asia, it's going to be a very serious problem. So it's still dependent on minerals, I would argue. But then the other aspect is with regard to this issue of the commons. You know, Ostrom's work, interestingly enough, was saying, you know, societies can come up with their own norms to manage common property. So she was also not in favor of government regulation, or nor was she in favor of private property. So, which my environmentalist friends many times will say that, you know, they will only dismiss the private property part, but they forget that she was also saying about government regulation. But she had all these caveats when that works, you know. And if you look at all her game theoretic analysis, often it is relatively small communities. It's those very homogeneous communities which have had existing norms and so on. And fine, if it is at that level, sure, then the small is beautiful and the Schumacher approach is great under those conditions. If you do not have those, I mean, her research will say that it won't work either. So that's when we need to bring in these other prospects to bear, you know. So in herder societies in Mongolia, sure, that will work very well, common property resource management. In New York City, probably not. So.
You might have noticed we've arranged for mining sound effects at the back. They're mining for pipelines under the road, which is the management of common property, the way Boston does it. So let me ask another question. Your narrative seems to sort of be, at least in the tone, as if there's a dominant narrative and yours is the minority. In fact, the world, when I see it, takes mining much more seriously, is really not going back to nature, is ruled by efficiency. So all of the things you are defending is really the status quo. These bad guys you've set up, these environmentalists, are really not the dominant discourse in practice in the world. The dominant discourse in practice is exactly what you are saying. So are you saying we should do nothing and we will be okay?
No, I would question the fact that you say the dominant narrative. I think the dominant narrative is very polarized. And on the one hand...
In practice, what would, if I can...
Yeah, in practice, yeah.
What would be different if we took you?
Sure.
For
so
your work?
Like the dominant narrative in terms of mining, just to give an example, is that we should have minimal regulation on mining. We have not even been able to pass the revision of the 1872 Mining Act, which Mr. Obama has now pledged to try and reform. So the status quo on that side is let there be complete unregulated mineral exploitation. Even with regard to coal and mountaintop removal mining, they have not really tried to look at the issue of restoration, because that's why I focus on that aspect. If you do not restore the Appalachian ranges, you're probably going to be stuck with absolutely unviable communities later on. Even though those ecosystems are very functional in maybe producing lots of other renewable resources, but if you don't restore, you won't be able to. And there is no good regulation system for restoring the Appalachian ranges. So that's what I'd say. The status quo on that end is not good. On the environmentalist side also, the status quo is not good, because they are celebrating poverty and going back to growing just your own vegetables and saying no to trade, and how dare you buy grapes from Chile, and you know. No, a lot of
policy, we are not going back to nature.
Yeah.
We are not growing our own vegetables. We are not stopping trade.
They're pushing in that. I'll give you an example in Vermont, and this is true in many places, in California also. They're trying to push for having a certain percentage of just local agriculture.
Agreed, but they're not winning. Right?
Well,
you guys are.
May well be, no.
So we have trade. We have efficiency. We don't have local growth.
We don't have
We do
trade.
have Walmart.
We have high tariffs against, we have perverse subsidies, we have high tariffs against agriculture from Africa. That's all terrible. I mean, you know that better than I do, that the trade aspect is terribly imperfect, especially when it comes to poverty alleviation. You know, that has been sadly been abused, and especially in Africa, it's a cause of immense concern. It could relieve poverty immensely if we had freer trade on those accounts. Ecologically based free trade. What are the best places to grow these things too? So that's what I'd say.
Other questions?
So earlier you just mentioned somewhat briefly sort of a topic of like the United States level of consumption versus, I think the example used was Japan's level of consumption. And
per capita, yeah.
Per capita. And so I found this sort of interesting because earlier you were sort of saying that the dominant or potentially dominant environmental perspective was one leaning towards sort of totalitarian or coercive controls over consumption levels. But I mean, if in the specific example of Japan, you do have social norms which are somewhat coercive against high level or you know, conspicuous levels of consumption. For instance, it's incredibly rare to find a Hummer in Japan for practical but also social reasons, because of that it's not really well respected. So while I think that a lot of my colleagues in the environmental policy field at BU would be very sympathetic towards poverty alleviation, isn't there a certain thing to say that the United States maybe should stop buying Hummers? And so that sort of narrative for limiting conspicuous consumption in the highly industrialized countries is valuable, at least in some respects?
Yeah, no, I'm all for trying to educate people to consume less and to be, especially when it comes to this kind of conspicuous consumption and you know, wastage, gross wastage. They have no problem with that. I would put in one little twist to it, which would be that in some cases you want to think about, are there certain irreplaceable livelihoods which are being created by that consumption? In the case of the Hummer, I would say no, because you would have many better jobs being created by having cleaner energy vehicles, by investing in the service sector for cars. So people are still getting jobs, but they're getting jobs servicing cars. Like in Pakistan, we drive cars for 40 years, and here we drive cars for much less, and there are many more mechanics there who are getting jobs rather than factory workers. So if you have that trade-off between durability and livelihoods, which is very important, and there's very little research actually on this issue of durability, which I find to be fascinating, then there is no problem. Okay, but if it is going to, like in the case of diamonds, otherwise a totally useless good, but if it wasn't for those, you know, love-obsessed fiancé crowd who want to get the diamond ring for no real practical use, Botswana would still be in dire straits, right? I can't think of, before that they had a beef economy, which wasn't a good idea either. So I would say, go for it, buy the diamonds, make sure they're from Botswana, and it's okay. And thankfully the Japanese are one of the biggest consumers of diamonds. Yeah. Exactly. So that's all I'm saying. I'm saying strategic consumption with a focus on livelihoods like that.
On that happy note, it's my pleasure to thank you for a wonderful talk. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. As you mentioned and as others know, Mr. Obama was also in town. We obviously made the right choice. And so did you. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you very much, Saleem, for being here. Let me once again ask Saleem to show his book, and I know it is available at the Barnes & Noble.
It's in the bookstore too, and also I'm going to have a website for the book which will be launched within about 3 weeks, and I really want students to be engaged in that. It'll be, the URL is already there, it'll be treasurebook.info, and I'm working to make it like a, continuing the conversation about the book.
Thank you everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Adil.